Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Boom. The problem with playing good music at the Stoa is that you just want to keep listening to it. But we have to begin today because we have a special guest with us. So first, welcome to the Stoa, everyone. I'm the steward of the Stoa, Peter Limburg, and the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And today is part of the Sense Maker in Residence series. And this is an invitation for sense makers to come in for a month, for 4 sessions, the same time each week, same day, to try to make sense on a certain theme and topic with us. And the idea is to evolve the conversation together. And today we have psychological superstar, Gregg Henriques. Gregg is the professor for the Combined Integrated Doctoral Program at James Madison University. He created something called the Unified Theory of Knowledge. And this series is going to talk about his framework, both in terms of the meta-crises and kind of the opportunities for wisdom that our digital age affords us. So that is quite exciting. And the MC of this series, each of these series has their own MC.
Sorry, I couldn't quite.
That was Siri just kind of like talking to me. So we got Unjin Kara today, a Stoa super user, kind of a wild man. So I'm 5% nervous handing over the emceeing keys to him, but it feels right at the same time. So I'm going to tag in Unjin in a moment. Unjin's going to maybe introduce Gregg a little bit, the session and the question and A protocols, and then we'll go from there. And this is 75 minutes today, but next week or the next 3 sessions might be 90 minutes. That being said, I'll tag in Unjin. Oh, it would be helpful if I allowed people to unmute themselves. Okay, so there you go, Unjin. You can unmute yourself now.
Hey guys, how you doing? Peter didn't tell the entire truth. Siri was actually his first choice, but wasn't the most cooperative at asking complicated questions, so that's why I was brought in. This is exciting. My dad's a psychiatrist. I grew up in a house full of psychology textbooks, and you'd have a pile over there that are about Jung. You have a pile over here about the brain, and you have a pile over there that's about Jonathan Haidt, and you'd just be like, wait, they all say different things. And the dinner table often was my dad being like, wait, none of this makes sense. Sometimes I pick from there, sometimes I pick from that. And so psychology for me, in a very visceral sense, has been this multiple piles of books around my house that didn't talk to each other. I found out about Gregg reading a book about ADHD, and it was talking about a similar thing where in ADHD, there's so many different theories, from the brain to neuroscience to the social aspect to development. And once again, not much of it talked to each other. And one of the authors quoted Gregg and said, hey, there's this interesting guy. I couldn't pronounce his name at the time, but Henriques 2011, with his unified theory of psychology. It seemed grandiose, and I was like pretty skeptical. But it's pretty stunning to see what Gregg has accomplished. He has a sketch on his website where he's got in 1997, he's done a little pencil sketch of what the theory of knowledge is. To see in 2020, people on YouTube and the internet finding out about him is just marvelous. Because the ToK for me in that second was, oh my God, those are all the books in my house coming together. Finally, somebody's put it together. So Gregg, excited to have you on. The way the session's gonna go is 75 minutes. Gregg's gonna do a lecture. Then we're gonna have a Q&A afterwards. Feel free to put your questions in the chat and I'll pick the ones that get upvoted. Do a +1 if you see a question for the first time. What could be helpful for me is if you see a +1, if you, instead of just writing +1 again, if you could make it +2, and if you see a +2, make it +3, it's gonna make it easier for me to see the most upvoted questions. Let's try that out. And there's gonna be 4 sessions, and Gregg, take it away.
All right, man. Hey, that was, thank you.
That's very warming of my heart and soul right off the bat, man. So I appreciate that. You know, it's good to see somebody else that's living the problem of psychology with all the damn piles of books and Brain and Jung and Jonathan Haidt. I love that, you know. Yeah, that happened to me in the mid-1990s. It made my head explode. And then I was like, well, what the hell, you know? Why is there so much chaos? I went down a rabbit hole and found something perhaps, and really happy to be here to share it. It's wonderful to be at the knife's edge. That's why I always try to be in it. So it's a great opportunity. And I look forward to these 4 sessions. So what I had planned was, yeah, I was going to run through maybe a 45-minute lecture or so. But certainly, you know, we can stop at I got various places where you can stop and dialogue. Give you an overview about what I'm looking at in relation. But it's also, you know, iterative process. I've really enjoyed all of the conversations that have been with, you know, Schmachtenberger. I know Daniel Gortz is going, Bonnie's happening. I listened to Zach's, you know, so many brilliant people here. I'm just really honored to be a part of it. So thank you, Peter, for the invite. And I look forward to sharing with you my version of reality. And hopefully it can add some little bit of wisdom to the chaotic world that we find ourselves in. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, hope folks can see this all right. So here's my tentative game plan. So what I'm gonna give you today, just sort of is a flashbang tour of the garden, all right? So my garden is my religion that's not a religion. You hear John Vervaeke and Jordan Hall talk about that. And I wanna share with you why I fell into, in the mid-2000s, a new atheist view into what would be sort of a naturalistic spiritual view. And some of my connections in relationship to that, some of the symbolism that's in that, why the hell I created a cartoon out of my theory. Certainly my dad wondered about that. He's a professor of history. What the hell are you doing? And it's like, I don't know, but it's a calling. Okay? And then I want to share with you why that is. Next week, I was thinking I would dive into justification systems. All right. Obviously, Peter Lindbergh shot across the culture consciousness with Culture War 2.0 and the explosion of different meme-plexes. And I can help frame that in terms of systems of justification and make a connection between human consciousness and our run around on this planet as persons and trying to justify why the hell we're doing what we're doing. And what that means for the chaotic wave of fluctuation that we're seeing in the various paradigms. Jai Dynamics places the systems of justification on our investment and influence patterns. That's what the I stand for. So we're investing and influencing and justifying. And that intersection of justification, investment, and influence, if you want to understand human behavior dynamics, that's a pretty good way, in my opinion, to do so. And then the third session, I'm going to talk about the problem of psychology. I'm completely obsessed with this thing called the problem of psychology. Following my good friend Zach Stein and his brilliant 4-part series, and learned a lot about the tripartite view of skill development, ensoulment, and transcendence, which I think provides a brilliant humanistic educational frame of reference for how we might cultivate ourselves in this time between worlds. I want to riff off of some of that and then offer my version of reality in relation. And my location is really, and Zach nailed this in his, actually, I think he was responding to Anjan, nailed in his response and said, hey, Gregg's working in the science domain, okay, and academia, which, yeah, I've been banging my head up against the academy now for 20 years. I look forward to dialoguing about that. And then finally, we'll see where questions are. I can come in and riff on the last session. I also have some ideas for meta-psych tech. So Jordan Hall, John Vervaeke got together, and John was talking about the psychotechnologies that we need, and then Jordan was talking about coherence, and it was like, hey man, we need a meta-psychology tech system. It's like, well, for the last 20 years, in many ways, that's essentially what my journey has pushed me into. And as a function of that, I can talk to you about how I'm thinking about metapsych tech in general. And at the same time, you know, if we've hit on a lot of conversations, then we can just riff and jam, and I'm good with that. So that's the basic game plan of the month. You know, this is a 21st century vision of wisdom. I'm not going to be talking an enormous amount about wisdom. You know, there's a whole, now in the last 10 years, 20 years, been an academic enterprise to try to delineate, you know, what is wisdom, where does it come from, what are its elements. I'm going to offer you a quick frame of reference on wisdom. I'm happy to talk about wisdom. For me, the short summary of wisdom is the cultivation of knowledge and practices that lead to valued states of being. Okay? So fundamentally, that's what I'm after. And so our question is, given the current state of affairs that we find ourselves in, what are the sense-making, knowledge systems, and the cultivation of practices that lead to what we can reflect on, and of course be open to changing, to be our valued states of being. So that's fundamentally what this is about. It's about sharing with you my sense-making. If we get into practices, what I use as a psychotherapist, as a neurotic son of a bitch, you know, all that shit to help cultivate a sense of being in this world that has purpose, matters, seems to add some well-being to self and others. So I want to start off a little bit to help folks. My system, this thing, I want to offer you some thoughts on grokking this thing, at least to enter into it, because a lot of people will experience my system as a bit of a maze or a cathedral. It's got a lot of twists and turns. It's got a lot of references embedded in it. So I want to at least start off and try to open up a frame of reference to this big system, the unified theory of knowledge. So we'll have some ideas about grokking the system. And then that means we have to say, well, what exactly is this system? So it's the overarching term for this, you know, kind of behemoth network, a cathedral of ideas, is the unified theory of knowledge. To grok the UTOK, it's helpful to start thinking of it as a unified theory of knowledge, tree of knowledge system, okay? And the word tree has got a play on several different meanings. Okay? So the first meaning is this cartoon depiction of a tree that can be thought of as the unified theory of knowledge tree. It can also be thought of as the me-atua ToK tree, which me stands for metaphysical empirical. And yes, this is a yin-yang symbol with little me's around it. It also spells out meme if you pay attention to it, M-E-M-E. There's a unified theory, a unified approach, and a theory of knowledge embedded in the structures. The unified theory of psychology, a unified approach to psychotherapy, one of which is a pure reason, the other is a practical reason that merges philosophy and psychology together into a new theory of knowledge. On the unified theory of knowledge tree are 8 branches, and this is where it gets kind of confusing. The tree of knowledge system represents the first branch on the unified theory of knowledge tree. To understand that is to understand my history. This was actually even discussed a little bit. It was in 1997 that actually the 4 cones, you know, I was fired it up one day and 4 cones fell out of my head. And my life hasn't been the same ever since, back in 1997. So for 4 years, I worked on and really elaborated and then ultimately published in 2003, the tree of knowledge system. At that time, I'm really basically trying to essentially grok natural science and do so in a way that allows me to make sense of the science of psychology. That's my first sort of vision, not a small task by any set, but this view of knowledge and cosmic evolution allows me a new way to sort the variables and extract meaning. But it's also, and ultimately what I would now call sort of as modern empirical natural science, meaning if those of you familiar with big history, it's essentially a map of big history in a way that solves the problem of psychology. And I now recently refer to this as men's knowledge. That's modern, empirical, natural, scientific knowledge. That started in 1997. However, from 1997, really, it launched a different kind of frame of reference that I'll be sharing with you in relationship to the garden, okay? The unified theory of knowledge is a wisdom-oriented philosophy to ground men. So we need to move from men's knowledge to women's knowledge, okay, in the 21st century. And my wife appreciates that and has been telling me that for a long time. So it is a transition from a scientific theory for the science of psychology into a scientific, humanistic, wisdom-oriented frame of reference that's grounded in science. But it's also grounded in science in a way that reaches out to our other systems of justification. Scientific systems of justification are grounded in logos, logic, analysis, and attempting to get at objectivity. Okay? But there are a lot of other ways of being in the world, ways that are grounded in our humanistic essence, and have ethos and morality and mythos. Okay? So it's to grok the system, you want to understand the tree of knowledge system is in dialectical tension with this metaphysical empirical theory of knowledge as a whole. And there are pure reason and practical reason elements that are embedded in it. Okay. It's also the case that I want to make a acknowledgement here that there's a connection between this version of reality and the Bible, of course. You can't help but note it's the tree of knowledge system if you know any Sunday school. And obviously then you have a tree in a garden. And I'll just also make a tie-in. So here's Jordan Peterson, who I really appreciate his Bible series. He opens up his Bible series talking about Genesis, okay? And notes a very powerful fact that the Christian interpretation of Genesis has as part of John. In the beginning, there was the Word. And Jordan Peterson offers, I think, a brilliant analysis of Genesis, the fall, the nature of self-consciousness, and what it speaks to us in terms of mythos. I encourage you to check out that aspect of his work. And it is an aspect that I speak to metaphorically in the naming of the tree of knowledge. That is ultimately, we need to come to a place that we have eaten off the tree of knowledge, and we need to learn how to healthily eat off the tree of knowledge and ultimately do so to cultivate a garden for ourselves, for our communities, for our nation states, and for the globe ultimately in the 21st century. And that is essentially the wisdom task, certainly in the Western intellectual tradition that I see us as confronting with. And ultimately my system is really about my version of reality as to how that might be accomplished. So what I'm now going to do then is I'm going to give you the flash, and then I'm going to stop, and then we'll pause and I'll see where questions are, things like that. So basically this next 2 minutes, what I'd like everybody to do is just take a deep breath, get centered, okay? Those of you that know Ken Wilber talk a lot about vision logic. You know that there are different ways of processing information. We can process information linguistically, and we can process information through perceptual reasoning gestalts. Okay? So what I'm going to do is give you a really fast 2-minute perceptual reasoning gestalt, and then we can come back and talk about the various parts about this. Okay? So this is my 21st century vision of wisdom in 2 minutes. All righty, there it is. So what I'd like to do now is just come back. I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a sec and see. let's see, Anjan, I'll check in with you and see if you have thoughts about any questions at this point want to take, or I can jump back in and then do the more detailed analysis of the garden as the game plan. But I figured I'd just pause here for a second and engage and see what your thoughts are, Anjan.
Does anybody have any questions?
Okay.
Greg, if I could throw my 2 cents in, I think when I first approached your work, I got overwhelmed when I came across the garden. Like, it was a lot of information for me.
Yeah.
I think what helped me was you had this story of just the ToK, like kind of the big history story. I'm curious if you'd want to start with just focusing on that, or that framing, if that would be of interest to you, and then kind of expand to that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Let me go ahead and, I have to pull up a PowerPoint in relationship to that, okay? That's definitely to organize the frame of reference. The reason I didn't actually start there was because I was back at the Stoa, I don't know, I think it was in, I remember exactly when the hell it was, June or something. And I did do a ToK on that. That was sort of the focus. But it probably would help to go back and just have some frame of reference in relationship to that. So let me pull that up and give a little frame on that, okay? Does that sound reasonable? All right. So let me find it real fast and I'll be right there. Okay. All right, let me share screen. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll then walk you through just sort of the basics of the first part of this set of ideas, that portal that got me involved in it. I'll share my screen. Okay, so the tree of knowledge system, all right, provides a framework, a novel framework for us to think about ways in which we want to map both reality, okay, and our scientific knowledge of that reality. That's one of the things that is important to realize about the system, is because I came to the system, I'm a psychologist, not a physicist, okay? But what I did then is I sort of cracked the code, or at least this is my, through the process by which humans justify, okay? By realizing then, those of you that are familiar with John Vervaeke's system will know that he divides human knowing up into 4 different P's. We have a base of procedural knowing, sort of the most basic. We learn habits, we learn basic frames of reference, and then we can engage in procedural knowing. He talks about perspectival knowing, talks about participatory knowing. I would argue that we share primates. Okay. But we humans also have another 4th P. It's propositional knowing. That's basically the process by which we semantically represent knowledge claims. And really what I did is with justification systems theory, I developed a theory of propositional knowing and its implication in terms of how it will take off. I did that in 1996, and it was because I then cleaved the culture person part of us in terms of the way propositions are organized from the primate part of us, okay, which are perspectival, procedural, participatory knowing systems. It fundamentally then set the stage for me to sort of grok the way people know and then flip that back on and say, well, if this is the way individuals know, then what are our justification systems for in various domains, one of which can then be science. Here's the tree of knowledge system. It's a new map of cosmic evolution. When we use the term cosmic evolution, that's basically a depiction of the universe starting 13.7, 13.8 billion years ago, in the context of what might be considered, I prefer to call it an energy singularity. Off the energy singularity, there's an evolution of behavioral complexity. which I will walk you through. Okay. The tree of knowledge is a theory of our ontic reality. By that I mean the reality independent of our beliefs and our scientific knowledge of it. It attempts to offer a consilient worldview. The term consilience comes from a man by the name of Edward Wilson, a famous big picture naturalist, who wanted a way to build the bridges between the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. In 1998, he produced a book called Consilience, the Unity of Knowledge. And the tree of knowledge system, one thing that Wilson didn't solve or address was the problem of psychology. And the tree of knowledge fundamentally is about that. It provides a view, I think, that allows us to understand how complexity emerges, all the way from quantum mechanics all to sociology. It describes a language system for defining behavior, mind, and science. That's actually where the root key issues of defining what psychology are. It offers a novel way to think about cosmic evolution across the dimensions linked by 4 joint points. And I think very importantly for the Stoa is a scientific sense and meaning making system. And what I mean by that is, look around, look at the information ecologies. We have brilliant people like Daniel Schmachtenberger doing a huge amount of wonderful work in sense making. What the hell is science? I have my brother who's like, scientists don't know anything because the COVID scenario and everything else. And it's like, you have to understand what science knows, okay, relative to what's unbelievably speculative, relative to all sorts of different political, chaotic, and not to mention a nefarious information environment where people are trying to manipulate and distort. We need systems to actually then say, well, hey man, I'll say this system fell out of me in about 4 seconds, and it really is just elaborated on its sense. There's been very little fluctuation as a function of this. So there are, we're not going to go back to thinking of the Earth as 6,000 years old. I mean, evolution is here to stay. And the periodic table of the elements is pretty rock solid. There are ways to consolidate our scientific knowledge, best theories together. At least that's what I'm positioning this. So when I talk about ontic reality, I mean that I'm inside science now. Science operates from a particular kind of realism. The realism of science is that there is a reality that's independent of our knowledge of it. Now, those of you familiar with quantum mechanics and general relativity and know that physics went from a complete independence of observer-observed into systems that actually have to get entangled, as it were, especially in quantum, but both in general relativity also. So there are lots of interesting questions about the relationship between observer and observed. But fundamentally, the scientific system of justification is that there is an ontic reality and that there are ontological theories of that reality and that there are systems of epistemological justification. So the modern empirical natural science says, hey, you have to have data. You have to then engage, and once you engage in data, you engage in experimentation. The tree of knowledge says that the grammar of science offers what's called an exterior epistemology. It means it operates from a third-person generalized view, and it divides the world up into objects, fields, and change. These are the fundamental elements of the grammar of science. That's really important to me as a psychologist, because there are some people out there that argue that psychology is the science of behavior. Okay? If you're following me, then you think about the idea that psychology is the science of behavior. Like, wait a minute, behavior goes all the way down. Okay, behavior goes all the way down into physics, and so the issue that psychologists get confused about is they then fail to separate key issues of ontology, which is the claims about reality, from epistemology, which is the process by which we know about that reality. So anyway, the bottom line is the tree of knowledge offers a theory of modern empirical scientific knowledge. It argues that we can describe object field change into 4 different dimensions of complexity known as matter. That's the first dimension, which emerges out of a pure energy singularity, life, mind, and culture. And that this represents an unfolding wave of behavior writ large. Okay? And one of the novel things about it then is that it then maps the ontic reality of matter, life, mind, and culture and posits that we can arrange 4 broad domains of the sciences in relation. So the physical sciences correspond to matter. The biological sciences correspond to life. Now that's standard, okay? What happens in science is that then you get into neuroscience, that's still real science and STEM, and then you move into psychology and the shit hits the fan. And what I mean by that is then there's an enormous amount of dispute and difference, so much so that you'll ask John Vervaeke, that there's an entire branch of understanding called cognitive science that breaks off from psychology and tries to be its own thing. The reason cognitive science emerges is precisely because psychology is such a, well, Anjan said it, you know, it's in such a fragmented mess. I would argue that cognitive science basically inherits the same basic problems, although it's somewhat more unified. It finds itself in a very, very fragmented place because we're lacking a fundamental sense-making system that allows us to get the grammar and language correct. So the basics of the tree of knowledge is the emergence out of a pure energy singularity. We can talk about this, how this might have a first inflationary reaction inside the energy singularity that begins a massive process of expansion and differentiation, okay? And then ultimately this explodes into the matter dimension. The matter dimension refers to, at the base is quantum mechanics, across scale is general relativity, and up in terms of the complexity and arrangement of objects goes into chemistry. There are certainly other very complex objects, like the Earth can be thought of as a complex object, but that relates to the size and multiplicity of it. Then we see about 4 billion years ago, 3.8 billion years ago, there's the miracle of life, the spark of life. We can talk about exactly what happens there, but fundamentally there's an inside and an outside of a cell organized around a lipid membrane. Somehow there's a correspondence between a storage of data information, DNA, and then maybe RNA initially and then into DNA. That allows for an intergenerational transmission. And then there are metabolic processes that do work to maintain differentiation, replication, metabolism, etc. Lots of fascinating ideas about what gave rise to life. Once it gets started, we see the explosion of prokaryotic cells, that's cells without a nucleus, and then into more advanced, bigger cells, big life. Shortly after big life emerges, we see another tremendous shift. One of the kingdoms splits off. So you have kingdoms of plants and kingdoms of fungi as big life. And then you got the animal kingdom. About 550 million years ago, animals get organized into complex active bodies that are then coordinated by brains and nervous systems. It is that process that the tree of knowledge introduces the capital M mind. So the term mind is to refer to the third dimension of behavioral complexity, the third plane of existence. Okay? So I look over here, I see my fish swimming around. In the language of the tree of knowledge, capital M mind, I'm observing their mind as they swim around, just as though you'd look at a living flower and you say, oh, that's alive. Okay? I can explain why we need this word mind. And what it does is it solves a lot of the split and confusion around what consciousness is and what behavior is in psychology. Then we fast forward to about 100,000 years ago, and you see the evolution from insects into fish, into birds and mammals. And then we see ultimately one particular primate adopts yet another interacting information processing communication system in the form of language. That explodes. There's a thing called the Justification Hypothesis that I was going to talk about next time. Provides a frame of reference for understanding why over the last 100,000 years, our system of being has escalated and so dramatically changed the balance of power. And the ToK system, as I mentioned already, then says as part of that evolution of justification, which dates back, 75,000 years, et cetera, clearly is in process 50,000 years ago. We see an emergence, and then 12,000 years ago, we see agriculture. It starts to merge with technology in particular ways, and particular kind of justification system that we call science emerges out of that and then functions to map the evolution of complexity. So it's a theory on the right-hand side of scientific knowledge or scientific ontological claims justified by scientific epistemology that then map the ontic reality of matter, life, mind, and culture. And then here's a diagram. So the blue is that ontic reality, and the red is the scientific onto-epistemology. Okay. What that means is that basically what we should be really instilling is a return to what Ken Wilber called the perennial philosophy, okay? The great chain of being that before it got meshed with Christianity, the great chain of being was basically there are rocks, there are plants, there are animals, and there are people. That great chain of being really comes from Aristotle. And virtually every philosophy, every culture that's ever been studied categorizes the world up into these 4 different categories. Now, what happened with modern science is they showed that the simple classification of rocks, plants, animals, people doesn't work, kind of like earth, wind, air, and fire. And therefore, as a function of it being not working, it got lost. And then was seen as simplistic and needed to be upgraded. Okay? But the question was, well, actually, we can now fill in the gaps and understand the emergences over time, and then also understand why rocks, plants, animals, and people exist on different dimensions of complexity or planes of existence. That's what the tree of knowledge affords us. Many, many different people have seen this in different ways. The tree of knowledge offers a particular kind of explanation for this 4-dimensional reality. So what as a sense-making system, okay, the tree of knowledge then encourages you to then view the world through a prism that organizes it around different frequencies. Material frequencies operate at in one way, biological living frequencies, mental animal frequencies, and culture person frequencies. And if you learn to see the world through that particular lens, I believe that you can then derive an enormous amount of clarity and coherence. So I'll stop there and see, Anjan, if there are questions that arise out of that, or we can move into a wide variety of different angles here, given that summary.
We got some questions in the chat. Just a quick question to you, Greg. What's your plan after this little question session? Do you have more to your slides? You said you wanted to talk about the garden.
Yeah, I mean, well, I got basically, you know, throwing a lot out there. I'm basically see what's alive for people. You know, I can go back to that. Listen, obviously, I flew through the garden just to give you a little bit of a rundown about what that is. It's a cathedral. I mean, you know, so it's like, hey, you know, there are lots of different elements that we can talk about. So that's an option. We can return to that. But why don't I take some questions and we'll see what feels interesting to people to move towards, and I'll go back to that if that feels where the flow takes us.
Just a quick clarification question for me then. Like there's this sect of YouTube that's like, the way to pick up girls is to understand how they're evolutionarily programmed. All of the human, and there's this like incredible reductionism that we're just this like programmatic beings that can only be understood in this evolutionary lens. Then there's this like other sect of YouTube that's like, oh, it's all about neuroeconomics. Keep the Doritos in your pantry out of sight. It'll require less willpower, therefore you'll be able to do it easier. Yeah. And then Jonathan Haidt's work that we talked about, which is you can really try to understand the relational aspects and justification and the social aspects of it. Am I right to understand the power of the ToK is to see that a human is influenced at all of these levels? It's not this is right or that. It's, hey, you can understand me by looking at each of these levels. How are the different ways my behavior is influenced and created?
Yeah, 100%. So what you have there is you know, I use the metaphor of the elephant a lot, you know, the blind men and the elephant, okay? That is that people develop paradigms to see particular lines of thought that are useful, okay? But what we lack is a paradigm that actually interrelates those lines of thought and then makes them cohere. And you hear that because then people make these absolutist statements, okay? Oh, everything's due to evolution, or everything's due to neuroeconomics, or everything's due to social construction. And the answer to that is clearly not. I mean, just not. You know, that's not the way it works. What you have is you're a system that operates at multiple levels and dimensions, okay? you're an integrated system that somehow is operating at all those dimensions coherently. The question is, how do you tease apart those dimensions and see their interrelation? Okay, that's the issue. So the social constructionist people make an unbelievably very point that we come equipped as a cultural primate, we come equipped to justify. Okay, we don't have content of justification, but we do. They don't make this point, but they then basically say, well, oh my God, if we're unbelievably sort of open at the level of justification, then what our sociocultural constructs are, then will play a huge role in how we dictate what's good, what's valuable, what men and women should do, what do we feel about the races? And of course that's true. I mean, look at, I grew up in a particular time 5,000 years ago. If I grew up in Siberian Russia, my worldview would be radically different, right? Okay, so my system of justification is enormously influenced by the cultural context. At the same time, I can go and look at people across the wide variety of different domains and see, look, hey, everywhere you go, people care about sex, they care about status, they care about getting injured, they worry about food. There's an enormous amount of similarity too. And there are evolutionary similarities, that you want to understand through a sociobiological level. There are neuro-based realities. There are operant realities. That's the Skinnerian particular kind of view. All of those have validity in themselves, okay? For me, the question is, what's the interrelations between the paradigms? That's the meta-theoretical question. And then the real philosophical question is, what is your metaphysical language system that you can bring to bear, and can you achieve coherence and clarity with your language system? Those are the two things that I wrestle with most.
We got some questions from the chat. So there's 3 questions that are pretty similar: Rain, Ron, and Cadell. So I'm going to call on Rain first, but Ron and Cadell, you're going to go next.
Thanks. Obvious question. What are the key differences between ToK and integral theory?
Okay. I like a lot of integral theory a lot. It's a couple of things that I really love about it. So I love Ken Wilber's concern with the material flatland and what science did, okay, in relationship to splitting off our epistemologies, overemphasizing exterior epistemologies, sacrificing, or the consequence, they didn't do this really intentionally, but the consequence of scientific language games was to essentially undervalue individual interior and collective interior epistemologies. So, and the quadrants then return us to goodness, truth, and beauty as a holistic philosophy is required for our fulfillment, right? That's one thing he did brilliantly in my estimation. The second thing that he does brilliantly in my estimation is understand stages and developments, and the line stage, and in particular, sort of the ego development. It gets a little simplistic at the color level, okay? But his analysis in 2017, I think it was, about Trump and postmodernism, and that what we need is second tier is a little bit complicated because it talks down to people, second tier consciousness, all right, that you got to go into teal, and this creates all sorts of tensions because everybody are very sensitive to hierarchy. Okay, but the idea that there's a pre-rational and a post-trans rational developmental sequence, that you can see people on those places, that we want to cultivate a particular level of integration along those lines is absolutely brilliant. So those are some real strengths I think that he has. I challenge some of him in terms of a couple of different places. His deep spiritual ontology, I'm more spiritually agnostic. He makes certain kinds of spiritual claims. My friend Andre Marquis, who's an integral scholar, argues that he makes a bit of a category error based on his own subjective perceptions and then makes generalized claims about the nature of ultimate reality. That's worthy of some critique. And I also, basically, I do a lot of work in upper right, okay? So in quadrants, if you speak quadrant language, upper right, what he basically creates a material flatland ontology for the upper right quadrant. That is basically, in my view, a big mistake. You want to change your thinking scientifically from physicalism to behaviorism. And then once you go to behaviorism, you can actually get a behavioral view of the upper right that corresponds to phenomenology and social systems and culture in a much more coherent way. So my contention is I've got an ontology that matches epistemology. His ontology and epistemology relative to science is a little clunky.
Seems very reasonable. Thank you.
Sure.
Ron, you're next, and then after that it'll be Cadell.
Thanks. Hey, Greg, this tags right on to what Rain was just asking you, and it's another Wilbur comparison question.
Okay.
And maybe you did answer this in a way, and you were just kind of alluding to it, but just in a very fundamental sense, do you agree with Wilbur's idea that consciousness goes all the way down versus the traditional perennial philosophy idea that consciousness only later emerges, either when life emerges out of matter or mind emerges out of life? You know, his idea, I think you know, is that every holon has an exterior and an interior, which is the way he puts it.
Yep.
And that consciousness not only goes all the way down, but is kind of like the origin.
Yeah.
And again, it sounds like you were kind of critiquing that, but I'm wondering
Yeah, I
how
critique
you view that.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I mean, there are sophisticated versions of panpsychism that are close enough to naturalism that I'm all right with. But there's no way in any level, in my estimation, it's not analogous to talk about a hydrogen atom having an interior. I mean, when we use the word as human beings, consciousness, okay? When I talk about consciousness, I talk about, hey, I'm conscious now, okay? And it does mean I have an interior. But tonight, when I get buzzed to go to bed, and then I'm out, okay? That consciousness is gone, so now I'm asleep, okay? And really, yes, okay, I'll flicker, my dreams will flicker on and off, all right? But you put me in a coma, I'm basically gone. And then and so to me, you need a brain, okay, to have phenomenology, all right? Without a brain, I'm pretty suspect. Now, you can absolutely have friends in physiology, do cell research. You can say cells have cognition in the sense that they're complex adaptive systems that process information. Okay, so I would argue that, yeah, they definitely have functional awareness and response, and there are definitions of consciousness that go into functional awareness and response. However, I don't believe they have any experiential awareness, and I believe that definitely it stops there. So functional awareness and response happens with cells. They have a sense, they're robotic essentially in the sense that, in my estimation, they would have no phenomenological interior, but they do have a sense-making interior. They do make decisions. They have autopoietic, complex adaptive functions that they process. But I don't think that to apply the word consciousness, even in a small amount, makes much sense. For me, consciousness emerges out of the neurofunctionality of mental behavior, which means it comes out of the animal mental dimension. I think it happens actually at the Cambrian explosion, and it corresponds to operant behavior in animals, basically. And there's a lot of, to me, cutting edge researchers that are explaining why that is right now.
Did you have a follow-up, Ron?
No, that was helpful, and sort of what I suspected was close to your view. So thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Great.
Next is Cadell, and after that, I'm going to read Ernesto's.
Hi, Greg. Can you hear me?
I can, Cadell.
Hey, yeah, great talk. My main question, I guess, is about, maybe first I would ask, do you consider theory of knowledge a meta language? And if so, how does it relate to other meta languages, basically languages which attempt to map our own knowledge?
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way of describing it. I know you're familiar with big history, and I'm sympathetic to what they were trying to do, sort of develop a meta view of natural science. I'm basically, with the tree of knowledge, I'm offering a more precise language system and one that solves the problem of psychology. And then in doing that, then we can say there is a way to talk about matter, life, mind, and culture with consensual agreement. We can talk about their interrelations in a particular way. And I published an article talking about, hey, let's correspond this with big history. There are lots of then other language systems that I know that I'm really interested in, certainly integral's one example, but Zizek's language system, you got me hooked on Hegel. I'm going back to Hegel and making certain kinds of connections along those lines. But I really do see sort of this meta-modern sensibility happening, where people are coming together with what I would call an integrative pluralistic sensibility. And what I mean by that, there's an appreciation for difference, but there's also a central force of integration and looking to correspond different systems not so much in a competitive, hey, you have to talk this way, but here's a system that makes sense. Do you see it your way? You know, what are the things that we're saying to be real? What's the void, to use the language you and I would be familiar with? And then, you know, and knowing that no system is going to be sort of the absolute truth, but the correspondence between metasystems is something I'm very interested in.
Okay, thanks. That's a lot of points to go off in the future.
So, thanks.
I'm going to read out the next question. It's from Ernesto. It's a slightly different take. This is going to be interesting. Just a few days ago, a Nobel Prize was awarded to Roger Penrose for his theories about the Big Bang not being the start of everything. So far, it would seem like the ToK theory and all human scientific knowledge has been restricted to events after the Big Bang. Considering that the Bible verses you showed suggest that God equals language and that those predate everything, and here's the question, is religion the only way to work with that which could have existed since before or has given rise to current physical reality and any knowledge we can gather scientifically or by means of our mind?
Huh, okay, let me unpack that a little bit. Good question. So yeah, let me contextualize what I think of in terms of human knowledge. And this can bridge off of Cadell's point. As I've said many times, it depends on what you mean by the Big Bang, but if the Big Bang, I'll start with one comment. If the Big Bang turns out to be wrong, okay, much of the edifice of my justification system definitely is built on some of that, and then my arguments are wrong or at least need to be significantly updated. So the first thing I want to say is that our knowledge systems are fallible. That's the inevitable nature of science. You make certain suppositions. There are variants on the Big Bang, I want to be clear, that lots of different variants that would be legitimate. There are explorations now on what is behind the Big Bang. Can we actually understand that the universe is a function of matter, antimatter, waves, and thus there's an implosion and then an explosion? You know, that stuff is not stuff that I have followed. For me, right now, sort of basically the Big Bang seems to be an epistemological and ontological horizon. In relationship to the question of God, for me, what the Big Bang comes out of is the void, okay? And that ontological, epistemological horizon can then basically then is where God can be found, as it were. In terms of my point about in the beginning, there was the Word, I was really making the reference, which certainly does connect to God and those kinds of elements. I was really making the reference that Jordan Peterson did, which is that the fall and paradise and eating from the apple really is about the emergence in humans of self-consciousness and propositional knowledge and the judgment and justification about what is good and evil. And of course, then that's going to give rise to our narratives about God. I wasn't necessarily making an ontological or metaphysical claim about God per se.
Ernesto, did you have a follow-up? Okay, cool. Greg, this is a little bit of a different question.
Okay.
It's from Dan. He's also asked for me to read it out. This came up today in conversation. If an animal has consciousness, is it capable of aesthetic, ethical, and poetic processes? Are animals moral or amoral?
Great question. I generally think of animals as amoral, and I think that for morality does require self-conscious justification on a social stage, okay? And what I mean by that is that, there is something radically different that happens at the self-conscious level when you start to explain your actions to others and are forced to give accounts. And while animals have very sophisticated communication systems and certainly engage in some levels of feedback, there's nothing in my estimation in the animal kingdom that has the flexibility, openness, and fluidity of human language, nor is there much in the way of indication that the level of their self-conscious reflection would then enable questions and philosophies and ideas about morality. Okay? Now that said, I certainly see lots of proto-morality in primates. And what I mean by that is there's definitely a distinction between an attitude of care, of an idea about what fairness is, an idea about reciprocity, ideas about self-deception and frustration. There's an enormous amount of what we would immediately identify as ethical behavior and less than ethical behavior and project onto that. For example, if you're familiar with bonobos, bonobos are a particular kind of related to a chimpanzee, but different. They're much more matriarchal. They also tend to be much more cooperative, much more giving, much less aggressive and vindictive. Male chimps can be really aggressive and vindictive and hostile and manipulative in certain regards and downright vicious at times. We can see the responses of other creatures, other bonobos and chimpanzees to those kinds of behaviors in ways that are more complicated than just operant reward. There's a sense of fairness, there's a sense of reciprocity, there's a sense of trust, there's a sense of pride and shame, I think, in these creatures. I don't think you need full self-consciousness for pride and shame. I can explain why. But all of that, again, gives rise to an intuitive, affective, phenomenological element that grounds all of our senses of morality. However, what they don't have is an explicit system of justification that they can feed back on, ask questions about, well, is this really moral or not? And for me, a full moral creature has got to be operating at that level of explicit feedback.
Peter's Force had dropped an article into the chat about there's a recent study. Crows are capable of conscious thought, science demonstrates for the first time.
Yeah, well, crows are unbelievable. So yeah, and by conscious thought, there's no, so crows, lots of animals demonstrate self-reflective awareness, okay, at the proto level. And we've done, that's Gordon Gollop developed a test for determining whether or not an animal can recognize itself in the mirror, that we are seeing the expansion of conscious thought, and by that awareness of whether or not the animal knows or not. There's a study with bumblebees that just came out that bumblebees can do cross-modal sense recognition. Okay, so if it touches something and then it sees something, it can recognize the thing that it's touched by what it saw in a bumblebee. Okay, so there is no doubt that we are seeing serious cognitive capacities, and as far as I'm concerned, absolutely, crows will have experiential consciousness. They'll have deliberation. They'll even be able to have some demonstration of, I know this relative to this. That's very different than self-conscious justification, I will say. Okay, so conscious thought does, when they say they're conscious, they don't mean like conscious like I'm right now saying, well, should I say this or should we go on to the next question? I'm going to reflect on that. Explicit intersubjective narration is very different, but an intuition of self, what one knows, what one doesn't, even deception of other animals, the higher animals show that, and crows are some of the smartest creatures around, no doubt. Which is kind of surprising given the brain size. I mean, people were all trying to find out about this. I mean, this is, ethology and comparative psychology. I prefer the term comparative psychology, or now the term cognitive ethology is very common. But, great stuff. And I think it behooves us to embrace, we've undershot generally animal cognitive conscious capacities in my estimation. I think it behooves us to look and embrace. But it's also the case sometimes people overshoot and then say, oh, they're just as smart as us, or they have language as us. It's like, no, just look at the last 50,000 years. Something was a game changer in the way we behaved.
Alex had a question to that. His question is language necessary for morality? A lot of videos show animals helping each other out, even when it's interspecies.
Well, again, it depends a lot on what you define by morality. Some people talk about rightness, some people talk about goodness, people have different theories of ethics, okay? If you have an absolute view of ethics, absolutist meaning that, that throughout the universe, good and evil have existed. Star Wars has an absolute view of ethics. There's a good light force where you make sacrifice for the good of the commons or good of other people. The ability to do that and to care about others is the definition of the good. If you're selfish and you injure others just for your own selfish and pleasurable gain, then you're part of the dark force. If you have an idea that the cosmos is governed by an absolute force of ethics, then of course animals demonstrate care. They demonstrate, morality in that sense. That's not necessarily my definition of morality. I believe proto-morality emerges as a function of relationship dynamics around cooperation and competition, about dialectics of self and other, about capacities to empathize and willingness to empathize. An empathetic view that is self-sacrificing is the phenomenological ground of our morality, but we want to then basically be able to say, hey, well, what actually is moral? And then once you do that, and then you have I have a universalist constructionist view of morality, which basically means we're grounded in this notion. And that's why we can get an enormous amount of agreement among people about what is morality, but it is also the case that we bring it into being and have the freedom to make judgments about what is morality, rather than we discover its essence as existing in the universe before we came along.
We have a couple more questions, but there's not so much more time today. What were you thinking, Greg? Do you think getting back to the presentation would make sense today, carrying it on next time, giving us some content?
Let's keep talking. We have 15 minutes. Let's keep talking. And so I certainly, I don't know if there's a communication process, but if people want to see the garden, they want to talk about consciousness, they want more tree of knowledge, there's meta-psych tech, the whole thing's available. I've done classes on this thing. So there's a lot of different directions we can go. I'd love to be responsive to where people's interests are and what feels alive for them.
If you guys want to drop it into the chat, Greg was talking about the third session would be with Zach. So I think that leaves 2 other sessions. Of the topics that Greg's mentioned, like the meta-psych tech or the justification hypothesis, what speaks to mind? I think that could be helpful, as Greg just said. Peter Sforza had a question that kind of takes it back to ToK and psychology.
Right.
If you don't mind fielding that. Peter, did you want to ask your question?
I'd love to.
Yeah, thanks, Anjan. Yeah, I appreciate this, Greg. I've came across your work, being frustrated with sort of the limits of modeling, simulation, visualization, and trying to resolve different competing models and hypotheses. And so I found your paper, which I think is part of the backstory to the tree of knowledge. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could speak to how within the field and discipline of psychology, you saw 2 major competing hypotheses, I'm paraphrasing, and worked to resolve those. I think the method there is a useful and general purpose kind of sense-making and meaning-making tool.
Yeah, thanks for that. And so I do believe that that's the case. I think you see it like in Peter's leadership here, because what happened to me was as follows. So I came up in my undergrad, I bought the empirical version of reality for psychology. Okay, so that's mainstream academic psychology. You take a Psych 101 course, and they say psychology is this field, it's about the science of behavior and mental process. And then they drop in and they immediately say, well, we don't, now it's about science. And then they basically teach you that science is about empirical epistemology, okay? Which I love science. I'm a hardcore scientist at one level. But what you realize over time, okay, is that facts are theory laden, okay? That facts don't just exist. Findings don't exist. Thomas Kuhn, of course, a famous philosopher, historian of science, talked about paradigms, and really facts reside in paradigms. I tell the story when I was at the University of Pennsylvania. I worked under Beck, and Aaron T. Beck, he's a famous psychiatrist, actually, although he's totally influential in psychology, for cognitive psychotherapy. And we were treating individuals who recently made a suicide attempt, brought all those individuals in. We ran the study for a year, and it was a complete failure for a year. Why? These are individuals who were, a quarter of them were homeless, really, really tough scenarios. 75% made less than $15,000 a year in Philadelphia. So think about living off of that. 75% had substance use problems, multiple disorders, and by definition, they came in making a suicide attempt. My job was to run this study. We ran it for a while. I figured out a few things about how to get people in, but then I couldn't get them in to stay. And then Beck learned about that, sort of blew up. We all had a big meeting, and we changed the study in lots of different ways, okay? and I'll get back to your question in a second, but this just makes the point. We changed the study in a wide variety of different ways, and then we reinstituted it, and lo and behold, it was a success. Now, how did we change the study? Well, virtually everything we did had a social work or humanistic flavor to it. Okay, that is, we created wraparound services, we maintained contact with them. I actually took over some of the therapy. I hired and showed how to do we did all of these things. Okay, and if we had done all of those things in the context of, say, having consulted a professor of social work, they would have come along and said, oh my God, the social work intervention is what makes all the difference. I mean, you have the data right there. Okay. Well, in Beckian land, when the focus is on Beckian cognitive therapy, all of those changes are interpreted as tweaks necessary to deliver the intervention. So we didn't write them up at all. I just talked about them when I made a presentation. So all of those efforts were seen as error and necessary tweaks. Yet if we had a different paradigm, we would have said that's the central intervention. Okay. And so what that shows, and then what I learned in my graduate training was, gosh, sometimes I look at somebody and yeah, those negative thoughts really do seem to be feeding back on some people. But sometimes I'm working with somebody and their thoughts seem okay, but their deep, dark feelings, they seem so defended against them, okay, that they seem really shallow. In other words, I want to go a deep dive into a Jungian depth psychology frame. And other times the damn family system is so chaotic, I think they're suffering. You know, if anybody saw the Ordinary People, it's a great movie in 1980. It's like, really, the guy looks like he's this one that's got PTSD and depression, but it's the mom and the family system that's all effed up, okay? So family systems view is absolutely central. So over and over again, I saw all these different frames of reference. Sometimes they were sort of these iconic exemplars. And then the question is, well, how do you move through them? How do you steel man them, okay? How do you respect that perspective without necessarily getting trapped and then defined against, okay? And that's a really key area. And I think that what like the Stoa tries to do in all these meme wars is everybody gets committed to their version of reality as if it's the only version of reality. No, it's actually an island of a version of reality in a sea of different possible versions of reality. So wake up to that, okay? Now, you can't stop there from my vantage point, because then all you basically get is eclectic chaos. All right. So then the question is there a meta superordinate level upon which you can actually see themes? You know, so you have a thesis and an antithesis. Is there any kind of synthesis? And that's what I started hunting for. For me, my first step then was I had to get out of the psychotherapy and back into the science. I got back into evolutionary psychology, which then provided me a step back. I was actually a meta, so I could see actually all the major paradigms at least adopted. And so there's a line of agreement. Unfortunately, from my vantage point, evolutionary psychology was committed to too many different assumptions that were rigid, that got itself defined against like cultural psychology and behavioral learning psychology in problematic ways. And so I tried to avoid that. And then I got lucky. I had a set of insights and boom. And then when the things were tweaked, and then all of a sudden I could see that everybody was saying something valid. But at the same time, I had a position where I could harmonize it. Well, then that's where I'd want to go. I've been very disappointed with the academy, because the academy claims that it's after these kinds of things. But the fact of the matter is that it's all about the contingencies that the academy is now structured under. Okay. So for me to come out and say, you know, psychology, actually nobody knows what the F psychology is. And its commitment to empirical eclecticism actually means that basically what you're doing is you're hiring full professors to build super sophisticated empirical sandcastles. Okay, what I mean by that is they have their operational definitions, they find what they need, they get all their funding, they get their doc students, and yeah, you can get like growth mindset and it's really interesting, but it sits in a particular relatively narrow paradigm. And then what's going to happen is somebody's going to come along, they'll redefine it. I mean, growth mindset basically is like interior locus of control that Rotter did back in 1955, for the love of God. Okay, we've known about this kind of stuff. They just put the different lipstick on the pig and get it out there. But the fact of the matter is that we're not getting different cumulative elements. So my response to you is, we're going to hold different positions, want to do it non-defensively, want to steel man various elements. When you see contradiction, wonder about a higher order synthesis, and also look at how trapped the academy is in relationship to how entrenched it is. And once it gets established, man, it's really, really hard to move.
Yeah,
Peter, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, it sounds like more towards like a pluralistic epistemology, and I agree. In the academy, it's challenged with the incentive structures and whatnot. In the modeling SimViz community, we kind of think about composability, interoperability as a grand challenge. And so the follow-up would be, you showed in your gestalt the movement from data, information, knowledge, wisdom. And in the mod SimViz, let's say we have architectures for data architectures, info architectures, knowledge architectures. What do you think about wisdom architectures in that? What would that mean in this kind of pluralistic epistemology?
Sure. I will say, I want to be clear, I'm a meta-modernist, not a postmodernist. Okay, so postmodernism just embraces the pluralism, but then through usually a critique of modernism and the injustices that are associated with that, and then that embraces marginalized pluralistic systems, which at a justice level is good, but in and of itself then serves as a critique function, and then it devolves. Ken Wilber does this brilliantly. He sees this. We definitely need an integrated pluralism, okay? So it's an integrated pluralistic epistemology. Not everything goes. It's not just whatever your epistemology. It's got to be anchored to certain principles. For me, what I then say is, well, what are the ultimate metacultural justification systems? I have a saying that I use that organizes my thinking. Be that which enhances dignity and well-being with integrity, okay? That's in the garden. Dignity comes from, I'll say this quickly, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the most consensual document ever agreed upon. And what that does is it justifies people's respect, respecting people, and then that legitimizes justice and rights. So it serves that unbelievably crucial function. Well-being is the mission of the World Health Organization. Took a hit in COVID, but nonetheless, well-being is a complicated construct that I've thought a lot about. It's the seventh branch on the tree, is how do you define what well-being is, human well-being, and then we want to expand that out to well-being ultimately of Gaia, i.e. the earth and all the creatures in it. And then integrity refers to accuracy, honor, truth, along those lines. So for me, what I'm looking at when I'm looking at a system ultimately is I'm going to take a step and use my universal morality judgments along those values to see, things that don't conform in a big way. In no political, without making a political statement at all, I cannot stand Trump because he violates the intellectual integrity principle. Okay, so it's a big three value, and as a function of that, then it's like, oh my gosh. So for myself, I do have a big three where I think you need, and not everyone needs to have those big three exactly, but if you have love, if you have trust, if you have freedom, I mean, there's certain kinds of ultimate meta values, agape, that really do set the stage for playing well with each other across the global scale. And I embrace those things.
Brilliant and inspiring. Thank you.
Greg, we only got a couple more minutes today. I'm curious if you have any closing thoughts, if you kind of wanted to prep us for the following week, and if there was any way you could share the slides.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, first off, I love the opportunity. I love this space, Peter. It's a great space. Okay. We have a lot of work to do, people. Okay. Look around. But there are opportunities for us to find better paths. So we just need to keep coming out together, figuring out ways to participate with each other, share ideas, figure out how to leverage the ideas that we have. I sent out a note to my listserv on the debate day. And I said, instead of watching the debate, I'm going to watch John Vervaeke and Jordan Hall and Christopher and Guy talk dialogos, okay? Because we need to be doing different things. So that's my fundamental thing. We need to be working to enhance dignity and well-being with integrity and seeking sense-making systems that do that. So that's my pitch.
I'm going to tag Peter in. Thanks, Greg.
All righty.
Beautiful. Thank you, Anjan, and thank you, Greg, for coming to Stoa. Really looking forward for the next session, and very grateful that you are here as SenseMaker residents for this month. So a couple of events, and you might be interested in this one, Greg. We're launching something called, let me just throw it in the chats, called Communitas Club. Me and Margaret are going to lead this series, and we're going to just investigate different conversational intersubjective modalities with a practitioner, maybe even the founder of it, where we're going to talk about it, get an understanding of it, and practice it. And it might be even ported in the Stoa, like Ria Becksbach's Collective Presencing or Edwin Rutsch's Empathy Circles.
Right.
And the first 4 we have lined up, I'll put them in the chat. So we have something called Entangled Bodies, Ephemeral Group Process. Forrest Landry is going to come and talk about that.
Oh, sweet.
Really cool tool called Reflective Structured Dialogue. I'm not sure if you know that, but like Jill D. Temple, she's bringing that into the academia. And then we have Circling in Toronto's Circling practitioner, Taylor is going to come and do that. So check that out. You can RSVP to the launch of that session, which is next week. Another event I think would be good to plug. Rain, do you want to plug the Hollow, the other sense maker in residence that's coming this Friday?
Sure. I will be emceeing the Hollow, the beginning of Bonita Roy's new series. From what I understand, she is putting forward this image of the Hollow as a gathering place, as something that's maybe a bit countercultural in how it engages in embodied sense making. That's about all I know. So yeah, I would love to see you there.
Great.
Yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun. So here's more events on the Stoa website, the Patreon, and the Substack. That being said, hope to see everyone next week, same time, same day. Thank you.
Alrighty. Thank you.
And Greg, could you hold on for like 5
Yep.
minutes? We're just
Absolutely.
gonna want to debrief afterwards. Okay.
Perfect.
Play some good music while people trickle out.